While there are few things that appear as concrete in America's political landscape than the Mormon and Republican alliance, that convergence was never preordained, and its origins were shrouded in the secrecy of backroom dealings. My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American religion and author of a number of books on Mormon history. And this is my fourth part in a series on Mormonism and American politics. I've done previous videos on the Joseph Smith era, early territorial Utah, the Mormon women's suffrage, and the fights over polygamy. And today I want to talk about the end of Mormon polygamy and how that paved the path for the Latter-day Saints to move into a new convergence with the Republican Party, something that's going to take quite a few decades and honestly a few videos to cover. Today, we're going to be discussing specifically the end of the 1880s into the 1890s and the first few years of the 1900s, where this Mormon Republican alliance that is now taken for granted was originally hatched. Central to the story is George Q. Cannon, arguably the most influential Mormon in the 19th century behind Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. He was a counselor in the First Presidency and in many ways the political intervening figure between the Latter-day Saints and American politics. Let's dig in. But before we get into specifics, let me give a refresher of where the Mormons found themselves in the 1880s. They were targets number one for the federal government, who were insisting on stamping out the Mormon practice of polygamy. There had been a number of legislative actions and then Supreme Court rulings that assured that these Mormons would be prosecuted, which led to many Mormon leaders, members, men and women alike, going on what they called the underground, running as fugitives from the law. Here is the wanted poster for John Taylor, who was the president of the church at the time, and George Q. Cannon. George Q. Cannon was the Utah territorial delegate to Washington, D.C., for 2 decades. He is the one that forged a lot of the relationships with the politicians who now saw much of that networking starting to fall apart. And the Mormons' primary enemies were the Republican Party, which is, of course, why it's so ironic that Mormons and Republicans will soon become colleagues in the political wars. But if you'll remember, the Republican Party was founded in the 1850s on the platforms of destroying what they called the two twin relics of barbarism: slavery, which they destroyed with the Civil War, and polygamy, which they are now trying to destroy with the anti-polygamy legislation. In response to the Republicans trying to push forward with their anti-polygamy legislation, the Mormons in Utah formed their own political party known as the People's Party, which mostly was led by Mormon ecclesiastical leaders who were the figureheads in the party positions. But even though they were their own party, they closely mirrored the Democrats in their principles, especially in supporting local control and opposing federal intervention. And George Q. Cannon, as representative for the Utah Territory, as a non-voting delegate, he affiliated with the Democrats, and he tried to win over Democrats to his side. There are lots of newspaper reports saying that he tried to carry himself in a way that would put him off as a genteel Virginia farmer. He dressed like other Southern politicians do. He even used a black valet to fit into the racial expectations of servitude that the South had. So in other words, by as late as 1889, when the Latter-day Saints were still insisting they weren't going to give up polygamy, any fusion, any collaboration between the Mormons and the Republicans seemed simply impossible. But all of that was going to change within a couple years. By the way, if you enjoyed this kind of content, this deep-seated geekery, nerding out on the past and considering what the implications and consequences are for the present, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. And if you're interested in giving back to the channel to make sure we can do more in the future, consider subscribing as a member to this channel and entering in the nerddom that comes with a few perks like early access to these videos. Anyways, let's get back to the history. By late 1889, The writing seemed on the wall. There was new legislation, new Supreme Court rulings that seemed to confirm that the Latter-day Saints were not going to be able to continue to operate if they continued practicing polygamy. So Wilford Woodruff, now the president of the LDS Church after John Taylor passed away a couple of years earlier, he and George Buchanan, by the late months of 1889, recognized that they were likely going to have to give up polygamy, something that they did not want to do, and frankly they continued not wanting to do, which is why they privately continued practicing even after they publicly gave it up. But after they start quietly sharing the news that the church was going to give up polygamy, George Buchanan traveled to Washington, D.C. He had, by the way, a couple of years earlier, served his time in jail after being convicted of cohabitation. And then once he was out of jail, he was kind of free from the legal consequences since he had already served his time. Anyways, he goes to Washington, D.C. in early 1890. And stops meeting with the Democrats. That was, I would argue, one of the most important points in the story of Mormons and politics, that George Buchanan, when he returns to Washington, D.C., looking for allies, now knowing the church was going to give up polygamy, instead of going back to the Democrats, who he had been working with, and he determined they were feckless and not willing to work with their allies, he meets with the Republicans, and he meets with several prominent operatives within the Republican Party, and they have a series of meetings in the spring and early summer of 1890, where, in the words of one Republican operative that's recorded in George Buchanan's diary, they said that if you are willing to switch party alliances, if the Saints were to shift from supporting Democratic principles to Republican principles, it might be an entire new world. We might consider new alliances. Now, let's take a step back and consider this alliance. Now, first and foremost, the Republicans were making it a condition of any potential collaboration that the Latter-day Saints would finally give up polygamy, which is what George Buchanan was finally willing to concede. Now, it's clear what the Latter-day Saints would get out of this alliance. They would finally get more recognition, and they were really hoping to be able to achieve statehood for Utah so they could govern themselves rather than being governed as a territory. But what would the Republicans get out of this alliance? Well, you have to remember that in the 1880s, the Republican Party started losing its national stature. It had dominated national politics since the Civil War. But due to accusations of corruption and a resurgent Democratic Party, the Republicans no longer had as firm a grasp over national politics as they used to. And one of the ways that they saw to restoring their grips on national control was forming a political monopoly in the Western territories. Here were all these territories that had been wanting to become states for a long time, including Utah, that were still territories, but if they were transformed into states and had an alliance with the Republican, that would mean 2 more Senate seats from each of those territories, and as well as congressional seats. And so the Republican Party in the late 1880s and 1890s start moving in a coordinated nature to get these territories turned into states and get those states aligned with the Republican Party. So that's why these Republican operatives started working with George Buchanan in that spring and summer of 1890 to get the Mormons to finally relinquish polygamy and then turn their affiliation over to the Republicans, and in return they would finally get the boot taken off of their neck. Now, George Buchanan was tasked to prove that the Mormons could pull through on their promises, which they did in a number of races in Wyoming and other Western territories that summer of 1890, where the Republicans took some surprising victories, showing that the Mormons could pull through. So when the Mormons finally officially gave up polygamy, at least publicly, that fall of 1890, the Republican Party rewarded them by continuing to work with them, eventually granting amnesty, something pushed by the Republican politicians in return for this alliance, and eventually a few years later, statehood, but that's a bit in the future. After the Mormons publicly forfeited polygamy in 1890, and again, I know all of you know this, they continue to privately practice it, but that's topics of other videos that I've done. After they publicly forfeited polygamy, the next step was to dissolve their political party, the People's Party, which they did in 1891, the last step that was needed before the Republican Party pulled through on their promise and granted Mormon polygamists amnesty for their polygamous unions that were formed before 1890, though there is still some debate over whether those families would still remain together. But that's outside the topic of this particular video. But there is a fear within the Mormon leaders. Now that they have this tentative alliance with the Republican Party among the LDS leaders and Washington, D.C. Republican operatives, there's a fear that as soon as they dissolve the People's Party, the Mormon-sponsored political party, most of the Latter-day Saints were going to flock to the Democrats because, again, the Republicans had been their primary opponents, and the Democratic Party's principles were more in line with the People's Party principles as the political parties operated in the late 1800s. So the LDS leadership, Wilford Woodruff, George Buchanan, and Joseph F. Smith made a deliberate decision that they needed to do more to promote the Democrats among the Mormons. Joseph F. Smith, who long blamed the Democrats for the death of his father Hiram Smith and his uncle Joseph Smith, may be a topic for another video, he wrote a pamphlet urging the Latter-day Saints in Utah to support the Republican Party. Simultaneously, the First Presidency allowed several church officials who affiliated with the Republican Party to go on a speaking tour throughout Utah territory, again saying that these are the virtues of going to the Democrats. And importantly, at the same time, they did not allow Democratic Mormon leaders to do the same. They muzzled them, like Moses Thatcher, who was an apostle, and B.H. Roberts, who were 70, both of whom called foul on this arrangement. Even the Salt Lake Tribune, which was a newspaper that affiliated with the Republican Party, called this a scam and a dirty compromise at the time. Now, you've probably heard these myths of church leaders going into congregations and dividing them down the middle and saying, you half will vote Republican, you half will vote Democrat. There's no actual contemporary evidence that that took place. But the spirit of that myth is mostly true, but it was in the form of Latter-day Saint leaders going around to congregations that likely leaned Democrat and trying to pull off a number who would vote Republican. And when the Republican Party won some surprising victories in Utah in the early 1890s, it seemed to win. And that's what granted Utah eventually statehood, something that was pushed by the Republican Party, again, as a reward for that early alliance. Now, Moses Thatcher, as an apostle, was so upset over this that he denounced the church's actions in the political realm. And in response to that, the LDS First Presidency in 1895 issued what scholars now call the Political Manifesto. We have the Polygamy Manifesto in 1890. Now we have the Political Manifesto in 1895, which said that church leaders could not run for public office unless they get direct approval from the First Presidency, which was a smackdown on Moses Thatcher and B.H. Roberts and the Democrats who were trying to push their party against the church leadership wills. Thatcher refused to sign on, and so he was eventually dropped from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. B.H. Roberts eventually relents, especially when he was told he would not be able to attend the Salt Lake Temple's dedication, something he and many saints had been looking forward to for decades, unless he signed on, which he finally did. And of course, Utah celebrated a couple years later when Utah finally achieved statehood, celebrating it with this massive flag that they draped from the interior of the Salt Lake Tabernacle. A year later, they moved it and they draped it from the side of the Salt Lake Temple, the largest U.S. flag ever created up to that point, which I just love the irony of the Mormons being seen just a few years earlier as fugitives from the American law, with their temples under siege and taken by the federal government, now draping the American flag off the side of the Salt Lake Temple, the very temple that was at risk. History is full of ironies. The next stage of this developing alliance between LDS leaders in Salt Lake City and Republican operatives in Washington, D.C. came in the first few years of the 20th century when Reed Smoot, an LDS apostle and a Republican, was elected to the U.S. Senate from Utah. This prompted a several-year-long congressional hearing. on not just Reed Smoot and whether he is eligible to be a senator, but on the LDS Church and whether they were fulfilling the promise to give up polygamy several decades before. I've touched on this topic before. I might do a whole video in the future on the Reed Smoot hearings. It was a fascinating national scandal that brought up lots of the LDS dirty laundry. It resulted in 2 LDS apostles being dropped from the Quorum of the 12. It resulted in Joseph F. Smith, the LDS president at the time, having to go all the way to Washington, D.C. and testifying before the Congress, giving answers that got him in trouble back home. But what's important for this video, and the only thing I want to emphasize here, is at the end of these several years of congressional hearings, where it very well might have resulted in how the Mormon political relationship had operated for several decades, where the government shuts down the Mormons and tries to marginalize and oppress them. Instead, by this point, due to the 15 years or so of this uneasy alliance between LDS leaders and the Republican Party, the GOP decided to stand by Reed Smoot, and Teddy Roosevelt and the Republicans backed him, and he retained his seat, which was the first major test. And so after those few years, you have this kind of awkward relationship of Mormonism and politics in Utah, where most of the church leadership was not just leaning toward the Republican Party, but worked and strategized and aligned with the Republican operatives, whereas a lot of the lay membership remained mostly leaning toward the Democratic Party. And so Utah is actually a swing state throughout much of the first half of the 20th century. But that starts changing in the wake of the Great Depression, and then especially the Cold War, topics that I will cover in future videos. I hope what's clear from this video is this Mormon-Republican alliance, something that is taken so for granted in the American political landscape today, that there are few groups as reliably Republican voters, that alliance was never foreordained to be. And in fact, the origins are shrouded in mystery in these secret backroom dealings between George Buchanan and GOP operatives. This is one of these fascinating lessons in history that should give context to the present, helping us know that where we are today was never set, predetermined to be, which means the future is not predetermined either. I'll be discussing more of this Mormon inchoate and awkward dance into American politics and cultural assimilation in future videos. Next week, I will dig into the response to FDR's New Deal, J. Reuben Clark, and the origins of Mormon anti-communism. I hope this video made sense. If so, please hit the like button, share it with others, tell me what I missed in the comments, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and if you're interested in giving back, please subscribe as a member to this channel, which I deeply appreciate those of you who have already done so. History has never been more relevant than it is today, and that's why these conversations are so important and why I'm glad to have them with you on this platform.